2023 has been an important year for artificial intelligence, and in particular, it's been a real milestone for generative AI. With the rise of AI-based image creation tools like Stable Diffusion or Midjourney, and of course the explosion of ChatGPT, it looks like we've just boarded a train that will take us to a very different world in the years to come. But are we ready for this new world? Do we know what we're messing with? Do you really know what ChatGPT is, why it works, and why sometimes it doesn't work that well? In this little video, let's sort things out a bit and go over a few really common questions and misconceptions we have about those machine learning algorithms, especially ChatGPT.
I've heard that ChatGPT thinks like us, but machines can't think, can they?
Well, no, a computer cannot think and reason. It doesn't have its own mind and feelings to react to situations. But over the years, algorithms, in particular the ones based on machine learning, have gotten really good at faking smarts and computing outputs that we, as humans, like to interpret as reasoning. Still, under the hood, a machine learning algorithm like ChatGPT is a very limited thing. It is only meant to approximate a complex mathematical function. It's just a fancier version of all those math problems where you have a set of points and you try to find the best fitting line to represent the main trend. Except that here, instead of controlling just the slope of one line, you have millions of little buttons, called weights, that you can turn and adjust in order to create a system capable of transforming most inputs into a somewhat viable answer. Note that a really big consequence of having this huge network of weights is that the final, tuned algorithm is extremely difficult to explain, meaning that we don't really know how the machine transforms the input, we just know that it usually does it quite well. But even people that have made the algorithm have no idea how it really works. This is known as the black box syndrome, because we have a sort of opaque black box masking out all the inner process to our understanding. And it's definitely a big problem in AI. So if you're curious and you want to learn more, feel free to drop me a comment down below and I'll make another video on that specific topic.
Wait, ChatGPT writes text? How can this be a math function?
In the specific case of ChatGPT, the underlying algorithm uses its complex math formula to try and guess what would be the best next word in a given text. OpenAI has then added a few extra shiny features on top of that to make it a better chatbot, but that's basically the core idea behind ChatGPT. So its input is a set of words, and its output is a possible matching word that could continue this little text in a reasonable way. It might sound a bit strange of a task at first sight, but guessing a word is actually a great way of getting a fairly generic and multi-purpose model, because you can then use this text generation principle in various ways by adding some contextual improvements. For example, for ChatGPT to get a more chatbot-like result. If you're curious, this two-step refinement process is what we call specializing a foundational model. To know how to pick the right words, the model is trained on a big amount of reference text. That's what we call the training dataset. All those texts are literally billions of sets of words. So basically, by feeding this to the machine as input data and comparing what the machine guessed to the actual next word in each text, we can know how far off the algorithm is, and then try and improve its performance by readjusting its weights. That's the backpropagation step, where you use the amount of error as feedback to retune the system. By doing this over and over again, you gradually get a lower error, and therefore a machine learning algorithm that creates outputs more in sync with the initial data that you gave it. It's also very important to understand that ChatGPT doesn't just learn by heart all of those texts. When it continues a sentence, it doesn't just try and find the initial chunk of text in a reference to copy-paste the rest. To a certain extent, its iterative improvements are meant to analyze and extract some language concepts, so that it can generate brand new sequences of words that don't look too impossible. For example, suppose that our AI gets the following word input: the mouse is eaten by the. A very natural choice for us would be to complete with the word cat. And indeed, you'll find numerous examples of this sentence on the web, meaning that ChatGPT has certainly read this chain of words hundreds of times, making it very probable to output cat for this input. But actually, it could also output something more surprising, such as yak. Of course, the mouse is eaten by the yak isn't as common, but it still makes complete sense, and this specific sentence doesn't exist on Google at all. In other words, the model learns to connect words at various levels, and after enough iterations, it's able to successfully generate credible text because it has trained to output less and less impossible sentences. So this initial training phase is the most important one. It's what turns this big pile of training data into a mimicry of a reasoning, and into an actual usable tool, the final AI algorithm. Once we consider that the algorithm isn't too wrong too often, we can stop this training phase and we get our big system of well-adjusted patterns that approximates a math function capable of guessing the best next word in a sentence and thus generate texts.
If an AI like ChatGPT is purely maths, it must be always right, right?
Nope. Despite its weeks of training and its perusing of billions of reference texts from all over the web, ChatGPT is far from flawless. Sure, it doesn't make grammatical mistakes, but it still doesn't think or understand what it's writing about. All ChatGPT does is properly chain words to get sentences that are the most probable with respect to its training dataset. Think about it. Earlier, we said that a system like ChatGPT wants to transform most inputs into a somewhat viable answer. There are two key ideas to keep in mind here. First, a viable answer just means that the machine produces outputs that correspond to the kind of outputs that were present in the initial dataset. This naturally implies that if this training dataset is biased in some way, the machine will be tuned to spit out those biased answers. And because a machine learning algorithm has no way of perceiving the outside world like we do, the only knowledge it has of its external environment is the data that we, humans, have given it. So the more inaccuracies, missing facts, or incomplete info in this input data, the more wrong and unusable the final AI will be. You've probably actually heard of all those bad consequences of AI where some image recognition model wrongly accused some people of crimes or couldn't recognize someone in a photo. That's because the initial dataset used during training was biased and incomplete. That's really important because it means that if we use AI blindly as a decision-making tool, without understanding its limitations and its guesswork, this might sadly just reinforce some of the biases that are already present in our societies, and further exaggerate inequalities. That's why it's crucial that we actually know how the algorithms are made, and how they have been trained, in particular by whom and with what data, because that will directly shape the vision of the world that the algorithm has. Secondly, we said that the machine works in most cases, but not all. That's because at their core, machine learning systems rely a lot on randomness. This is why ChatGPT rarely comes out with the exact same paragraph twice in a row. This viability comes, once again, from the initial dataset. Remaining loose and vague or experimentative is the best way for the algorithm to get okay answers often, and match as many of those reference outputs as possible, the best possible. We call that trading accuracy for genericity. But this also means that an AI like ChatGPT can make mistakes, because this goal of being right all the time sometimes leads the algorithm to hastily patch together false facts, or even to have learned some wrong connections that were only a side effect of its training data. So yeah, not spitting out something that is learned by heart is great in terms of novelty, but it's also way more risky. And guess what? Because none of its training implied doubting or assessing veracity, ChatGPT will always sound completely confident in its answers, no matter how crazy they are. After all, for ChatGPT, there is no right or wrong, it's just a complex math function, and its only objective is to output the most probable next word given a huge list of references. This issue has often been referred to as AI hallucination, because the algorithm is basically concocting a completely false idea and then presenting it as a hard fact, just like all the others. This means that when using ChatGPT, you should always be super careful of what it's posing as fact, and not be duped by the pretty writing and the nice grammar. Just because there aren't any spelling mistakes doesn't mean that there aren't more profound errors.
But then, how come ChatGPT works that well when I try to use it?
One of the main reasons why ChatGPT is actually worth all the fuss is because it's not just this text generation model. In fact, ChatGPT is an evolved wrapper around an underlying model called GPT 3.5. At least that's the one used for the default ChatGPT version. And this GPT 3.5 is the actual real word guesser model. So the GPT 3.5 model is just meant to generate text based on probabilities, and on its own, it's really not that good. For example, starting some paragraph about 1492 in America will always end up in a little text about someone discovering the continent, no matter who that someone is, and how blatantly false it can be. And even worse, by default, the base GPT 3.5 model has absolutely no notion of a question-answer chatbot-like conversational setting. It just likes to continue text with more words. So if you enter a question in the input field, it might answer, but it might also decide to just ask a bunch more, because there are also a lot of examples on the net where someone has written a series of a few complementary questions. And again, GPT 3.5 doesn't know that you want it to answer, so continuing with more questions is just as possible an answer. One of the ways to counteract this, that OpenAI has done for ChatGPT, is to use what we call a pre-prompt. The pre-prompt is a little text that you put before any actual user input to try and tell the model what it should act like, and what's the current context. So that's why ChatGPT is able to do questions and answers. It's been told to be a conversational agent. We've given it a role to play, a persona to be, and this tunes its word-guessing probabilities in a more relevant direction. For ChatGPT, this pre-prompt is still a secret, although it's quite clear that it's being continuously updated by OpenAI to further enhance the results as time goes by. And we know that this pre-prompt plays a big part in the AI always acting kind and avoiding, or at the very least staying neutral, for touchy subjects like politics or religion. However, this pre-prompt isn't a silver bullet. So another technique to make ChatGPT more useful is what we call fine-tuning. Fine-tuning is about taking a fairly generic model that has already been trained, like GPT 3.5, and retraining it just a little bit more for a specific task with more specialized input data. For example, in the case of ChatGPT, chats and discussions. More precisely, here, OpenAI actually did human-supervised fine-tuning, meaning that they asked real humans to write the best possible answers to various questions, at least the best answers according to those people, and then trained the model to match those answers, rather than matching the ones that it would have produced by default. And finally, to increase the performance of ChatGPT even more, the team added a third layer of improvement: reinforcement learning with human feedback. To put it simply, the idea was to take a bunch of questions and ask ChatGPT to generate multiple answers for each, and then OpenAI asks humans to evaluate how accurate, interesting, and relevant those answers were. So here, contrary to the previous step, humans don't have to write anything. They simply need to compare and classify answers from the best to the worst for each question. This new data can then be re-injected into the model to increase the chance of outputting answers deemed relevant or interesting by human evaluators, and conversely avoid useless, inappropriate, or even shocking ones. This third phase is therefore a way of adding some censorship to ChatGPT to get a more universally acceptable chatbot. But it's worth keeping in mind that this ad hoc ethical flash course is just the result of evaluation by one group of human evaluators with their own biases and beliefs. Still, by combining these three techniques, it's therefore possible to get a more powerful, interesting, and yet respectful model than the plain foundational model GPT 3.5. And yet, those post-processing improvements don't change the inherent nature of the machine, and they can't prevent all of ChatGPT's mistakes.
But won't ChatGPT be able to learn from its mistakes? Can it evolve and become better?
Yes and no. At a high scale, ChatGPT is just one of the most recent versions of large language models, or LLMs. And its underlying text generation model, GPT 3.5, is a new version of the previous GPT algorithms. With each generation, OpenAI increased the size of the model by increasing the number of adjustable weights in it, and it gave the model even more training data to try and expand its knowledge of the world. So in that sense, you could say that LLMs as a whole are evolving and improving. But the exact ChatGPT algorithm that was made public in November 2022 and is based on GPT 3.5 cannot evolve and change. Because despite all the big words and semantics that we try to use to make people think that artificial intelligence resembles ours, there is still a fundamental difference between a machine learning algorithm and our brain. They don't have brain plasticity. Once you've stopped the training, the model becomes like a fixed photograph of a neural network. And because this AI has no sensors to get exterior stimuli, and its entire vision of the world is determined by its training data, an AI like ChatGPT is basically working in a vacuum. That's why if you ask ChatGPT to tell you about the available movies at the cinema closest to you, it will tell you that it doesn't have access to real-world data, and it will advise you to rather consult an actual website to get the info by yourself. But there are more insidious cases where you may think ChatGPT is bringing you real info, where in fact it's just hallucinating something with little to no ties to the real world. A famous example is if in the midst of a conversation, you ask ChatGPT to give you references to more articles, because in that case, rather than telling you that it can't do a web search and tell you to find the info for yourself, ChatGPT usually prefers to invent completely fake sources that look real but don't actually exist. So ChatGPT cannot learn continuously, and it cannot improve gradually. It cannot evolve like a human brain does and adapt to exterior events or be aware of the latest news. In other words, all the mistakes or inaccuracies that it learned from its initial dataset will remain until someone decides to train and publish a new version. Because under all the shiny chatbot features, and besides all the new startups that are building tools based on ChatGPT, this machine learning algorithm is just one big old math function that is just trying to guess the right word. And on that note, that's it for today. I really hope you enjoyed this video and that you learned a few things about ChatGPT or perhaps got some answers to a few questions. If you're curious, this video is available as a text article, and here are some interesting references to go further and learn even more about ChatGPT and its impact on our societies. And I also want to thank you for being so many to support me and have joined the community. That's just amazing. And if you're curious about tech, AI, game dev and all that sort of stuff, there's definitely a lot coming up in the upcoming months, so be sure to subscribe to this channel and ring the bell to not miss the next videos, and follow me on the social networks to keep up to date with all my latest news. As always, thanks a lot for watching, and take care.